So with the founding of the moral majority in 1979, you've got the concerted effort of people like Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell to campaign for Republicans and to recruit Republicans who are pro-life and to split off from the Democrats people who, based on the Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox teaching of life beginning at conception, or their Protestant counterparts, to defect from the Democratic Party, join the Republicans, and form the pro-life movement, and to gradually start to unseat and undercut Democrats who are supportive of Roe v. Wade or who previously had not been compelled to take a position on the issue. And they make abortion an issue everywhere they think that will be to their advantage. And they enter the fray in the race for the White House on the side of Ronald Reagan, and they ultimately get a pro-life plank added to the Republican platform. It used to be, prior to the days of Trump, that the Republican Party would have a platform committee, and approaching the national convention every 4 years, they would have prepared, by the delegates chosen according to their party system, a statement of beliefs for the party. That's called the platform. In other words, what do Republicans believe? A person could look to the platform as maybe a justification for their own position, or a way to identify and recruit like-minded supporters by pointing to the Republican platform. And people could know in writing what is it that Republicans supposedly believe in general as a party. And they got the pro-life plank added. I'm not sure if it was in 1980. It might have been not until 1984. But eventually they did succeed in doing that. The Republican Party became officially pro-life. And this was a wedge issue on which they were beating up Democrats and winning some elections. Now, the problem that comes along with every wedge issue is the fact that the people who support the wedge issue might eventually demand some results. And pro-lifers were routinely disappointed by Republicans. I know this because in those days I was a young Reaganite and I was caught up in the pro-life movement. And I was often disappointed and often had the impression that elected Republican officials were not really that into the issue because they didn't seem to want to spend any political capital on behalf of the unborn. And of course, that's because that was the reality. The unborn don't vote, and they were not willing to spend political capital. They were not willing to trade their power, potentially lose an election in order to defend people who would not be able to vote for them ever. So the battle over abortion began to look more and more like a sham, depending on how much political success the Republicans had. What do I mean by that? Well, there came a point in time in which they actually took over the government lock, stock, and barrel. Republicans had like 3/4 of the state houses in the country and the governorships. They had clear majorities or working majorities in both houses of Congress. They had the presidency, and most of the judicial appointments were Republican appointees. And by the time of George W. Bush, after 9/11, and with the advent of the 108th and 109th Congress, we're talking from 2021 to about 2023, they had control of everything. And so the pressure was on them to do something about abortion, because all these years they've been talking a big game about being pro-life, but they hadn't really done anything on the federal level except symbolic things. And what they came up with was what was called the partial birth abortion ban. They got this passed and signed by the president. And this was the idea that abortion would not be allowed in the case of a procedure which may not even exactly exist, but I'll let you read up on that on your own. But the point was, you couldn't take the life of a baby as it was being born. And remember, a good wedge issue doesn't really have to be based on reality. But they could get a broad moral consensus that this very gory, brutal, gruesome procedure should not be performed, and that the federal government would ban it. And they did so, creating no exception for the life or health of the mother, knowing full well that the courts would all strike it down. And indeed, federal court after federal court struck it down. I believe it was struck down at least 5 or 6 times until it wound up in the Supreme Court. And this law, which had been passed in 2003, reached the Supreme Court in 2007, and by a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court actually upheld the partial birth abortion ban. And Republican officials, elected Republicans in Congress, absolutely wet their pants in terror. And they never did another thing about abortion. They did nothing else with their working majority in that realm. They were terrified because the implications they knew would begin at that point, because it's one thing to posture and complain about an issue and campaign on it when the law is very clear. But now the Supreme Court had made the waters much muddier, and pro-lifers were greatly encouraged, and Republicans were terrified. And I suppose a lot of them were thanking their lucky stars that they lost their majority shortly thereafter with Barack Obama. And for the next couple years, they had a good excuse for not doing anything about abortion. If we fast forward, though, after the days of Barack Obama, which of course energized all those racists and lowlifes that I talked about in my most popular video on the history of the Republicans over the last 3 decades, Trump arose, of course, right? Largely aided by people who were outraged about President Obama and are still outraged about President O'Biden, they call him, because in their world, President Obama continues to pull the strings for his old vice president and continues to have a puppet in office working his will. And this, of course, is unacceptable to racist and ignorant people. And of course, it's ridiculous to the educated and intelligent, but at any rate, this is part of their mythology and part of what they've built on and worked with. But President Trump was elected by these people. He was not popular with the Republican establishment. John Boehner resigned, and of course, the new speaker, the youngest speaker ever of the House of Representatives, from Minnesota. I forgot Paul. I forgot his name. I apologize. But he couldn't get along with Trump, and he resigned. And Trump had no real support among mainline Republicans. He had to do something. And the people that he met with, of course, were these moral majority types who now felt like they had a comeback, and they had a guy. All they needed to do was get him to say the right magic words and to take up their issues. And Trump's flexible. If nothing else, he was willing to do that. What do the religious guys want? Well, they want him to do this, that, and the other about abortion. They want him to say the right things. They want him to get the prayer breakfast going again, or whatever it is that their demands are. But abortion would be high on the list. Trump said, "Well, how do I end abortion? I mean, isn't that the Roe v. Wade and all that?" I'm sure, like his people, I don't think Trump even knew that much. And they said, "Well, yeah, you got to get justices on the Supreme Court that are going to be pro-life." He said, "Well, how do I do that?" Well, it turns out Paul Weyrich had helped found the Heritage Foundation, which had grown beyond his wildest dreams. It superseded the moral majority and was even more successful. And they had a list of people they could trust, and it was from that list that Trump agreed to pick his Supreme Court nominees. He packed the court with 3 of these people. They managed to slide through Congress through the hearings, but largely by being disingenuous in the hearing room in answering questions about Roe v. Wade. And they actually overturned Roe v. Wade. And if Republicans were wetting their pants in 2007, Republicans are beside themselves at this point, because now the chickens have really come home to roost. What was supposed to be an imaginary wedge issue is now an actual issue. As many as 64,000 women may have already been personally affected negatively by this, and women are livid. And this is why many of them call it Rovember. It's coming up because Trump didn't understand that the game was to get the votes from the people but never satisfy their concern, never actually deliver on the pro-life promise, Trump didn't know any better. He actually kept his word for maybe the first time in his life to those people and got Roe v. Wade overturned. And now he's left trying to pretend that maybe that's not what he did.